Good evening. I'm Chris Horvatitz.
And I'm Dave Graber. We're coming to you live from our News 4 studios in North Buffalo for the debate between Nick Langworthy and Max Della Pia. We'll meet the candidates in just a moment, but first we want to begin with a look at the rules that we'll be following over the next hour. There will be no opening statements tonight. Each candidate will receive 30 seconds for closing statements. When candidates are each asked a question, they'll receive 60 seconds to answer. For follow-up questions and rebuttals, each candidate will be given 30 seconds to answer, clarify, or refute information stated by their opponent.
The candidates are running to represent New York's newly redrawn 23rd congressional district. It will now include a large part of Erie County. The new district also contains several counties in the southern tier, stretching from Chautauqua County in the west to Chemung County in the east.
Now it's time to meet the candidates. Republican Nick Langworthy is the state GOP chairman. Before that, he led Republicans in Erie County and worked for former Congressmen Chris Lee and Tom Reynolds. Nick Langworthy lives in Niagara County, which is not in this district.
Max Della Pia is running on the Democratic line. He's a 32-year Air Force veteran and ran for the Democratic line in 2018. Della Pia is the Democratic chairman of Tioga County, where he lives. Tioga County is also not in this district.
Gentlemen, thank you for joining us tonight. We drew cards from a deck to determine who would go first, and Mr. Langworthy tonight will lead off.
And we'll begin, gentlemen, with the economy. What plan, Mr. Langworthy, will you present to your conference to slow inflation?
Well, let's be very clear. We have a crisis going in America right now. Inflation is out of control. And as we travel around this district, it's very evident to me in the meetings that we have with constituents what angst that this has created with family budgets, with gas reaching $5 a gallon this summer and now creeping back up to cost of groceries, which, you know, a trip to the grocery store is a major economic discussion for families at this point. One plan I would have right out of the gates is to fight hard for American energy independence once again. You know, our transportation costs, the cost of home heating, the cost of our fuel to get to and from work, it has driven a skyrocketing of inflation. You know, diesel fuel is at record highs this year. And we have a administration under Joe Biden that has shut down the Keystone Pipeline, that has absolutely made it much more difficult for, you know, organizations to get leases and to drill. And we need American oil, not to bow down before OPEC asking for more.
Mr. Della Pia, we'll put that to you. What plan would you present to the Democratic conference to slow inflation?
With 32 years in the Air Force, I consider energy independence to be a national security issue. We should not be going up to someone in Saudi Arabia or somebody in Venezuela and asking to kiss their ring to lower prices. However, the Inflation Reduction Act has provided opportunities for expanded drilling, which is something that I favor. We certainly want to ease away from fossil fuels, but it won't be a switch. We need to be energy independent right till the day that happens and beyond, because it's a national security issue. And I feel very strongly about that, and it hasn't changed throughout my campaign. So I would say that we have a situation where the people on the other side are saying Biden's the enemy, and they condemn him for whatever, instead of Putin, who's really behind a lot of this. It's global and it's complex.
We'll stick with the economy. Mr. Della Pia, the advanced estimate of the U.S. third quarter GDP comes out next week on Thursday. There have already been 2 straight quarters of GDP decline, often an indicator of a recession, yet the Democratic administration has been hesitant to call this a recession. I'll put that to you. Do you think we are in a recession, Mr. Della Pia?
You know, my background is certainly, I got an economics degree from the Air Force Academy and a master's in national resource strategy. The point is we need to put some stops on the economy. In Congress, we don't control all the levers. Certainly monetary policy would include raising the discount rate, and that will reduce the amount of money in the supply, and that should reduce inflation. But there is always a danger of doing it too fast and too soon, and we need to watch that because it can cause a recession.
Mr. Langworthy, your response to that?
It's a crystal clear answer. Yes, we're in a recession. How do you know we're in a recession? It feels like a recession. When you go around and you go meet with voters in a diner, they think we're in a recession. You know, people have more economic angst right now than we've had probably since the global collapse in 2008. And people are changing their behaviors. They're changing their spending patterns. You know, the inflation is eating away at our family budgets, and it's pinching the middle class in Western New York and the Southern Tier almost more than anywhere. So we have a recession on the horizon. I don't care what Joe Biden wants to define recession as. It's upon us. We have to, have, some reality checks on our federal spending. Just because we have all these off-budget bills in these programs that the Biden administration wants to spend with reckless abandon, it is not going to get us out of this mess. We have to be real. We have to prepare, and there's going to be some tough times ahead.
Mr. Lang,
rebut, please.
You may, yes.
I would say that, first of all, we need to remember that an inflation reduction bill is a 10-year process. It is intended, it's a layered policy, and it's going to take some time. But it's an important thing that we do that and acknowledge that policy doesn't happen immediately. And post hoc propter hoc is a logical fallacy. After this, therefore that. It's not true. Biden being in the seat does not cause it.
We'll stay with the economy, Mr.
Actually, I'd like 30 seconds if we could.
You could have 15.
15? For my opponent to talk about this Inflation Reduction Act, I mean, this would be like to say that spending $750 billion to somehow lower costs for Americans, it's absolute lunacy. This would be like a family sitting at their kitchen table trying to figure out how to pay their bills and say, let's just max out the credit card this month.
Gentlemen, we're going to move on now. Staying with the economy, obviously it is an important issue. A big impact of rising inflation has been the cost of fuel and utilities. The Biden administration helped to ease gas prices months ago by using the nation's petroleum reserves. Now, understanding that industry experts say tapping into the Keystone Pipeline and others like it would have a minimal impact on fuel prices, what else would you do or support to help ease the burden on essential expenses? Mr. Langworthy, we'll stay with you on that.
Well, the reality is that gas had gone up 49% from before Russia ever invaded the Ukraine. So the fact that the Biden administration has tried to use the conflict in the attack of Russia on Ukraine as the excuse for high energy costs, it's absolutely not true. Energy is a speculative market. On day one, the first order of business by Joe Biden and his administration, as he bowed to the environmental left, was simply to shut down the Keystone Pipeline, to use the bureaucracy to slow down leases, to absolutely, grind energy to a halt. They sent the message to the energy sector, we're closed for business. We have a war on natural gas in this state. These are things that are in the way of progress. We need American energy out to market to create good paying jobs, but also to lower our home heating costs, lower our cost of transportation for Americans. We should not be bowing down to Saudi kings begging for more oil.
Mr. Della Pia, same question to you. You have 60 seconds.
This is, let me just give you a little bit of in economics 101. Really, it's supply and demand. So if you look at the situation 2 years ago, obviously people were hunkered down. They weren't putting a lot of demands on the system. And when there are not demands and the supply is the same, the price is low. So that's an important factor. Also, we really need to look at increasing our ability to produce oil, and drilling is important. And our oil companies have really done a disservice. They have basically put their profits over the American people, and they need to actually adjust their production capability and their refining capability, and that will take some time.
Mr. Della Pia, if I may ask a follow-up here, you talk about supporting drilling efforts in this country. Do you support fracking, particularly in places like Pennsylvania and even in New York?
I hesitate to give them a thumbs up until they'll tell me what they're putting into our ground and the effect it will have on our environment. So I would much prefer to look at other alternatives that are actually better for the environment, and that would be like nuclear power, something we've used since 1954 successfully without a single failure, and I think it's something that should be checked.
Mr. Langworthy, we'll give you 15 seconds to respond to that if you'd like to have it.
We absolutely need to bring safe exploration of natural gas in the southern tier, bring the jobs, the thousands of jobs that would be created, the good-paying jobs in some of the poorest counties in the entire state of New York. And we have to fight the environmental extremists on the left that have gotten in our way of that progress.
Thank you, Mr. Langworthy. We'll stick with you for this one. Mr. Della Pia made reference to supply and demand. Issues with the supply chain are impacting every consumer in this country. What do you think the U.S. can do to bolster manufacturing here, perhaps right in the southern tier in the 23rd district, and stop relying so much on foreign nations?
Well, unfortunately, our country has gotten addicted to cheap stuff from China. And we absolutely suffered greatly during the pandemic when so many things that we needed to rely on to protect our people, our frontline medical workers, were all manufactured in the Far East. We don't make enough things here in the United States anymore, and we need to incentivize American manufacturing. The Southern Tier, I'm a son of the Southern Tier. I grew up in Chautauqua County. I'm the son of an auto worker and a tavern owner, and I know the strength of our industry in Chautauqua County and what we brought to the table. And so many of those factories are gone. We need to look at, at our state level, the business climate that we have in New York, which is pitiful, and we lose a lot of opportunities even to our neighbor to the south in Pennsylvania. But we need to manufacture and incentivize manufacturing here at home. We should not have to worry about getting all of our supplies that are so necessary from the Far East and other countries.
What steps would you take, Mr. Langworthy, to incentivize manufacturing in Congress?
I look at tax credits are one big way that we should incentivize manufacturing. Those are opportunities to bring jobs from other countries here to the United States, and we have to look and get creative to source those things here in the United States.
Mr. Della Pia, 60 seconds. What can the U.S. do to bolster manufacturing here at home?
Certainly, we've done many of those things already with the CHIP Act. Much investment is appropriate because, once again, this is a national security issue. When you look at it, we expose ourselves. It's a vulnerability when we have to depend on the likes of China and whatever. We should be manufacturing things here, and we're doing just that with the CHIP Act because, as you noticed, when we did not have sufficient computer chips, it created a bottleneck for our automobiles, all electronics, and it actually increased the price and delayed delivery. So this is something that we need to do. We need to think strategically, not only what we might need for war, but what we need for our economy. And also, if we're fighting something like COVID, we can't depend on a foreign country to give us what we need.
And Mr. Della Pia, Mr. Langworthy said he supports tax credits. What's your thought on that?
I do too.
Okay.
Mr. Langworthy, I want to turn now to the issue of gun control. Republican Congressman Chris Jacobs, who you once endorsed, is proposing a national licensing program for high-capacity assault rifles. Given the unique propensity for mass shootings in this country, and also understanding that most are committed with illegal handguns, what role should government play in reducing gun violence?
Well, New York State already has more gun laws on the books than any other place in the country. They didn't save any lives at Tops on May 14th. It hasn't saved any of the lives of the people that have lost their lives. It didn't save Kiara's life, and as she lost her life, two weekends ago in very tragic circumstances. More laws are not the answer. We have to tackle the issue of mental health, and it has been ignored for far too long. I mean, when we have a tragedy, so many people on the left run to go and ban guns from law-abiding gun owners. The people that commit these heinous murders and crimes, they are not deterred by more laws. They're not looking to say, oh, am I in compliance with the New York SAFE Act? They wish to harm others. And until we get real about mental health in this country and analyzing what is the profile of the people that are committing these heinous murders, we're not going to solve the problem. More registries, more red tape for law-abiding gun owners will not work.
Mr. Della Pia, before I give you some time to respond to that, Mr. Langworthy, I'd like to ask specifically when it comes to things like mental health or eliminating the red tape or eliminating some of that bureaucracy, what specific steps will you take if you were elected to Capitol Hill to reduce gun violence in this country?
Well, it seems to me that the federal government wants to create a commission to study all sorts of different things. Yet we have not had a commission to study what is the profile of these mass shooters. I think that we should use the resources of the Congress and the federal government to really get to the bottom of what is causing people to have, this sort of murderous intent. And we have serious mental health deficiencies. And coming out of COVID-19, this is something that can be very helpful for us coming forward, because many of our youth are very troubled at this point after the isolation that we've faced.
Mr. Della Pia, 30 seconds to you, sir.
We shouldn't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. So what I would say is we need universal background checks, and it's across the board, no exceptions for transfers between family members or friends or gun shows. We also need to eliminate those multi-round magazines. We've done it in New York, but it doesn't do any good if you go across 10 miles south of the border and get them from Pennsylvania. We need national, reasonable gun safety legislation.
Mr. Della Pia, if I could follow up on that, today the Attorney General, Tish James, she released a 5-month investigation and a report from that investigation talking specifically about social media's role in that white supremacist, self-described white supremacist Tops shooter who is suspected of killing 10 people and injuring 3 others. What role do you think the government can play when it comes to stepping in to head off some of that extremism that is clearly born online?
This is something that is, you might have heard the term, the alt-right rabbit hole. These young people, they may not fit in to their group, but they start with humor that's at the expense of perhaps minority people. And it gets worse and worse, and in the end, they're looking at, fascist, Nazi type, and every click, every minute that they spend on these sources, what happens? Someone makes money. So it's really driven by greed and money. And these people think these kids are thinking they're doing something good.
May I have a rebuttal?
Yes, 30 seconds to you, Mr. Langworthy.
We have, a situation, and there has to be accountability, and we have to ask tough questions. It seems like these tragedies happen, and then they end, and other than a gun control debate that follows, we never get to the bottom of what is the story of this individual. Max, you and I are both parents, and I would hope that if my kid was in the basement writing a 500-page hate manifesto, I might know something a little about what's going on in my own household. And I think there's been far too many instances where we turn a blind eye to the story leading up to these tragedies.
May I?
You may, Mr. Della Pia, 15 seconds.
Would you also be able to respond to the 11,000 signatures that were fraudulently foisted upon?
Gentlemen, we're going to keep the questions from this side of the desk and not between either of you. We're going to go ahead and move on right now.
And we will move on to abortion, a major issue among voters, particularly on the Democratic side this year. The Supreme Court, of course, sent the issue back to the states earlier this year. Republican Senator Lindsey Graham is proposing a national ban at 15 weeks. The question, do you believe abortion is an issue for the states or for the federal government? Mr. Della Pia, we start with you on this one.
It is going to be an issue whether the Democrats take over the majority or whether the Republicans do. And that's been made very clear by Lindsey Graham and others. Their intention is to put it across the country. They've already done trigger laws that have basically taken the right of a woman and her doctor to make a decision that is life-changing on her health and her reproductive rights, and they're willing to do that across the board. This is this is something that's on the ballot for this election, and it's a critical one because it's not just, this is just a start. There's going to be issues about things among or between people who live in the same household, contraceptives, equal rights for marriage. Those things are all coming.
Mr. Langworthy, you have 60 seconds. Abortion, a state or a federal issue?
You hear my opponent and you hear Kathy Hochul with her constant special interest paid for ads running nonstop talking about how abortion rights in New York are under the gun. The Roe overturn has taken abortion and taken it back to the state level. New York is the most liberal abortion rights state in the country. They, in fact, my opponent and our governor, they support, abortions right up until the moment of birth. And that, I think, is an absolute, it's something that I certainly couldn't live with. I think we have often, we see too many people that are pushing to end life and not to support life. I mean, I just had a son born last week, little Oliver, and we spent some time in the NICU at the hospital. And I saw parents there for 10 and 15 weeks. They told me their stories about their trying to be there with their children. We need to promote life.
And Mr. Langworthy, on Senator Graham's proposal for that 15-week ban, if that came up in the House, would you vote yes or no?
I think there's a series of proposals out there. It took 50 years to overturn Roe v. Wade, and there's going to be more and more discussions after we, take back the House in this election. But realistically, we're running on kitchen table issues in this election. The Democrats have tried very hard to make this entire election about abortion, and they're failing miserably because Americans are sick and tired of people trying to divide rather than provide solutions to the economic woes that are in front of us.
15-week ban, yes or no, Mr. Langworthy?
I have not, there is not a proposal, there is not a piece of legislation. I am pro-life, make no mistake. I support rape, incest, and life of the mother as exceptions on that issue. But we just have a fresh decision on Roe v. Wade, and now it's a states' rights issue.
Right, we'll give Mr. Della Pia 15 seconds, beg your pardon, to respond.
So 15, actually, the exceptions have not been what my opponent has talked about. He's 100%. So that means a 10-year-old who's been raped or is a victim of incest, or a woman who has an unviable fetus or is endangering her life. The government should not make that decision for that person or that family.
Mr. Langworthy, 15 seconds to you if you'd like to respond.
I mean, Max is interpreting my record however he wants. I am a pro-life, leader, and I am proud of that. At the same time, I have criticized your party, Max, in your support of abortions up until the 9th month. I think it's a reprehensible position that's really hard to explain.
Mr. Della Pia, do you support abortions up to the 9th month?
No, and I think I would remind my opponent that he's running against me, not Hochul or Pelosi or any of the other people. Pay attention to what I say and what I do, and make a decision on that.
I'll be honest, if I get called a forced birth politician, well, I don't even know what the hell that means, Max.
Well, figure it out.
Mr. Della Pia, let's move on. What is your opinion on the president's plan to cancel student debt for millions of Americans? Did the president go too far, or did he not go far enough?
If you look at it, it's very well targeted, people that are not of means. But it is something that I would have preferred happened through legislation, not through this. But you need to realize that the previous guy actually canceled the debt for the 2 years that he was in, and nobody said a thing. But what this president did is he removed the cloud that was over these folks and their families. And we'll just have to see where that goes.
Mr. Langworthy, 30 seconds to you on the issue of student debt.
I disagree with President Biden's proposal to eliminate $10,000 to $20,000 of student loan debt. We have taught a generation of Americans, really since at the height of COVID, but then throughout, that there's such a thing as a free lunch. I mean, I grew up in the Southern Tier as a son of a small business leader. I know there's not such a thing as a free lunch. You have to work hard for everything you do. When you make a decision, when you sign for a loan, you are owning up to that. And I think what we have here is a lot of people that want to get out of bad decisions. But what about the people that didn't make those decisions, that didn't go to college, that went to trade school and have a job that has allowed them to pay off their loans?
Gentlemen, let's move on to the southern border.
May I?
You have 15 seconds.
Did you get, I'm curious whether my opponent got any help to get through school. And when you think about the difference between when McConnell went to school and had $300 in tuition, this has become unaffordable. We need to, as a country, decide how we can make it affordable for people again without massive debt for their families.
Gentlemen, let's move on to the southern border. Again, a very popular issue, especially as we approach the midterms. This one to you, Mr. Della Pia. Agents at the southern border have had more than 2.1 million interactions with migrants, with more than 400,000 during the months of August and July alone. Mr. Della Pia, what steps will you take to address the crisis at the southern border? And then we'll also add, what about for the cities beyond the border who are dealing with an influx of people who need services, who need support, very much like what's happening in New York City right now?
Well, first of all, we need to absolutely rethink and redo our immigration policy. My opponent will probably say we should enforce the laws we have on the books right now. And I would say this, if we don't fund the bureaucracy or the bureaucratic process of getting someone from a legitimate asylum claim and getting him through and on to a place that's safe and as a productive member of our economy and our society, we are doing them a disservice and we're doing our economy a disservice. We absolutely need to solve that problem, and it needs to be a bipartisan approach. And we literally need to get together and do that. We have put it off. There have been attempts all the way back to the 70s. This is a critical issue that can make our economy stronger by postdoctoral.
Before I give Mr. Langworthy 30 seconds to rebut, I do want to follow up with you, Mr. Della Pia. Should Kamala Harris, the vice president, should she be visiting the border as the borders are?
I think she needs to listen to the people who are doing it. If she thinks that she's not getting the proper information, she needs to go and do that. And I would encourage her to do that. But we need to fund the process of getting people through that asylum. I'm not for open borders at all. I want everybody properly vetted. I want them to pay taxes. I want them to pay Social Security. And I want them to be a productive member of this country when they are appropriate for it.
Mr. Langworthy, 30 seconds to you about the southern border.
We need to finish the wall. First and foremost, we need to fund and give the resources necessary to our Customs and Border Patrol agents to watch that southern border and to properly handle this situation. We've had 2.5 million people come across that border, including countless amounts of Chinese fentanyl that comes in here and kills 300 people every single day in America. The southern border is a crisis. This isn't about Mexico and the U.S. It's about the U.S. and those that seek to harm the United States of America. We need to have a border to have a country.
Gentlemen, we're just about. Mr. Della Pia, you may have 15 seconds. Go ahead.
We absolutely need to get these people processed, and we can't do that without funding. So throwing out fentanyl, I mean, that's a very important issue as well.
Mr. Langworthy, 15 seconds if you'd like it.
Well, I mean, this is the policies of this administration, since Joe Biden took over, are to turn a blinder on to the crisis at the southern border. Kamala Harris has been to the North Korean border more than she has been to our southern border, and she's supposedly running the process here. This is a joke, and we need real enforcement of our border.
All right, we'll move on now as we've reached about our halfway point. And Mr. Langworthy, this one is for you. Who won the 2020 presidential election?
Joe Biden's the president of the United States, last I checked. I mean, he won the Electoral College. He's been serving for the last 2 years.
Poll after poll, PolitiFact found earlier this year, poll after poll, a majority of Republicans continue to say they believe Joe Biden did not win that election. You're the leader of the Republican Party here in New York. What have you done to put down those false claims?
Well, I mean, people have angst about the changes that were made to a lot of our election laws, not necessarily in New York, but in other states in the name of COVID-19. You had governors declaring by executive order a change to how elections were operated. And that really brought a lot of questions of fundamental fairness and equity under our Constitution. So there are legitimate concerns. I think a lot of those have been tightened up. You look at changes in the state of Georgia. In New York, I'm very proud of the fact that we have a bipartisan Board of Elections that is a self-policing system, and people can have faith that we have fair and honest elections here in the state of New York. We absolutely, I'm someone that lives in the future, in the present. You know, we cannot continue to look back on 2 years ago. We have to challenge ourselves to solve the problems that are in front of us. In one way we could do that and get everybody on the same page in something I will do when elected to Congress is national voter ID legislation.
Mr. Langworthy, do you think the people who showed up to the Capitol on January 6th were there because they were upset about COVID rules that were instituted during the 2020 election?
When you have states that changed the way they administered mail-in voting, they did it not through their legislative process, but by executive order, and you had a lot of ballots that were being circulated in states like Nevada and in New Mexico. They changed them on the fly, and people were upset. That was a very dark day in our nation's history. It was something that should never have happened. But at the same time, we need to tighten up our election laws. We need to make sure things are done in a constitutional fashion and go to the courts if necessary.
Mr. Della Pia, we'll give you 30 seconds on that subject.
It seems that my opponent's position on that has changed a bit. He said that he thought that it was a Democrats' extravaganza, as I think he called it, and I would go, seriously? You're blaming this on the Democrats? I think we're projecting here, Mr. Langworthy, and I would say it's not that difficult. Insurrections are bad.
Mr. Langworthy, you may respond if you'd like.
Listen, there's a reason that you see Democrats creating things like the January 6th Commission and trying to relitigate the past over and over and over again. It's because they can't run on their own record in this election. And they're trying to change the narrative in this country away from the failed policies of the Joe Biden administration, the inflation that is crushing family budgets. That is why there is an obsession with the past president not talking about the record of the current president. So it's quite laughable that that's what my opponents bring forward.
Mr. Della Pia, we'll come to you in just a moment. I want to ask Mr. Langworthy, though, staying on the topic of January 6th, the former Vice President Mike Pence said that he had no constitutional power to change the results of the 2020 election on January 6th. And I want to ask you, Mr. Langworthy, if that is your interpretation of the Constitution as well.
That is my understanding as well.
All right, Mr. Della Pia, you may respond.
My opponent says relitigate. We absolutely know, we need to know exactly what happened, why it happened, and do what we can as a country together to decide how we can prevent it from happening again. And he is clearly someone who's supporting Trump, and I feel that he has asked for his endorsement. He was part of the transition team. He was with all those folks that, you know, Bannon and Miller and the Rogue Gallery.
We'll give you a chance to respond to that, Mr. Langworthy, but let me ask Mr. Della Pia first. There are historical instances where Democrats have objected to electoral results. Is it your opinion that objecting to electoral results is appropriate under any circumstances?
Absolutely, where appropriate. But when you have 60-plus court cases with zero evidence and every single one was thrown out of court, what conclusion do you come to? It wasn't based on fact. It wasn't based on evidence. It absolutely is a sham.
Mr. Langworthy, to you.
Well, it's funny. Hillary Clinton still thinks she won the election in 2016 and hasn't figured out that she just lost because she was a lousy candidate. I think that the Democratic obsession with President Trump is crystal clear, and that they are trying to change the narrative in this election to get away from the actual pitiful record of the current president.
Mr. Della Pia, let's go ahead and move on at this point. Do you think President Biden should run for re-election in 2024? We're asking you to explain your answer as well.
That's his decision. I don't think I should be making that decision for him. I think he's gotten a lot done since he's been in office, and I'm proud of his record.
Again, I'm not asking you to make the decision. I'm asking you if you think, in your opinion, if you are elected, would you support a Joe Biden presidential run in 2024? Mr. Della Pia, that's to you.
I'm not sure.
We'll move on to Mr. Langworthy. Similar question. Do you think former President Trump should run for re-election in 2024?
I mean, this is a personal choice by President Trump. He has to decide if he wants to open his life up to another campaign. He got a lot of great things done in the 4 years that he was in the White House. And we had policies that, let's face it, if not for the people that don't like President Trump, they certainly did like the economy that was on fire and doing so well, and record job creation. We have a lot of really great policies that we need to restore in this country. He had a record that we could be very, very proud to have, and we'd like to bring back that economic record. The failures that we've seen, in the last 2 years, they've erased a lot of good progress.
I'll ask that question this way, Mr. Langworthy. If the former president were to run again, would he receive your endorsement?
I have been a supporter of President Trump's. I continue to have a great relationship with him, but I don't deal in theoreticals. I mean, if he becomes a candidate, we will have a conversation about that.
Mr. Della Pia, your hand is up.
For him to say, for my opponent to say that the economy was just going great guns because of the former president is kind of absurd. If you understand economics, you know that these policies, like the Inflation Reduction Act, take time. And he was given a good economy, and he takes credit for it. And you should know better.
Mr. Langworthy has 15 seconds before we close this topic out.
Our President Trump had a stellar economic record, and but for a unprecedented global pandemic, we probably still would be in growth territory right now instead of the Biden recession that we're all suffering through.
Mr. Langworthy, Independence Party petitions for gubernatorial candidate Lee Zeldin included more than 11,000 signatures that were found to be copies, and they were disqualified. They were thrown out by the State Board of Elections. Those copies, according to the state BOE, had been made on copiers in your party offices in Albany, and yet you've been claiming for months of a lack of transparency among the Hochul campaign. What is your answer to the state BOE?
Well, the process was that the petitions, in a very chaotic process, in a timeline that was truncated by the redistricting lawsuits, there were many different people bringing many different piles of petitions from all over New York State, and they were assembled in a short window of time. This is something that petition copies are made often. They ended up as part of the volume. I haven't touched a petition personally in many years. I've kind of retired from that element of the politics. But obviously a mistake was made. It was discovered by the Board of Elections. The petition was disqualified.
Mr. Della Pia, you have 30 seconds.
This is not a mistake. This is fraud. And my opponent knows that it happened in his office, and copied signatures never go in to a bound petition. And if it did, he, as the captain of the crew, needs to take responsibility for that. If he didn't know what happened, and he doesn't know now, then he was asleep at the switch. He can't have it both ways.
Mr. Langworthy, 15 seconds for you, sir.
I mean, Max Della Pia is the Tioga County Democratic chairman, and he knows full well that as chairman of the party, you do not leaf through every single petition for every single candidate that runs for office.
Gentlemen, let's move on. Mr. Della Pia, you have been outspoken about supporting universal health care. How would you actually propose that taxpayers pay for that kind of a program?
Well, actually, if you look at the actual statistics, 21 industrial countries actually have universal health care. And we as a country spend about 2.3 times what their average is across the board. There are many ways of getting to universal health care, and we should explore all of them. But we need to realize that when you allow people who are just out there to make money and are willing to for every commercial premium dollar, every $3, $1 goes to administration. The guy on the phone or the gal on the phone that says, sorry, it's not covered. It should be going to the people who need the care. And that, by taking it away from these large healthcare providers, and that's a big issue. We're talking fraud, and I could get into it if it wasn't just a minute.
Are you saying you would support the elimination of either insurance companies or large healthcare providers? Is that the transition you were saying this company should make?
I'm not saying that I'm going to tell people that they can't keep their insurance. I just want everyone to have quality health insurance because it's an economic issue. It allows them to be productive members of our economy and our society, and we don't end up with a situation where these people wait until they have an emergent condition to go to the ER, and then we as a country still end up paying for it, but it could have been a much smaller number if they had had proper care initially.
How do you suppose taxpayers should pay for this kind of a program should you be elected and should the country actually transition to it?
I think if they want to buy into something like a Medicare type program, if they want to do that as opposed to keeping their commercial, they should be able to do that. But if you look at the amount that it costs, if we don't allow the special interest to control it, we could actually save money by doing it.
Mr. Langworthy, 30 seconds to you.
My opponent is a Bernie Sanders Medicare for All supporter. He wants, whatever word salad he just delivered, it doesn't add up. The fallacy that single-payer health insurance programs are going to solve our problems. I mean, Obamacare itself has driven the cost of health care greatly. I mean, ask yourself, are my premiums lower than they were 10 years ago? Of course they're not. They've exploded, and they're a huge burden on our private sector. They're a huge burden on our government sector.
Mr. Della Pia, 15 seconds to you, sir.
I would say it's clear to me that the intention of the Republican Party, if they take the majority, they intend to pay for Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security, and decide on it every year or every 5 years and make it discretionary spending. And I think that's a cruel way to handle an issue that's central to our elderly and people that just have one income, and it's Social Security. It's frightening.
Gentlemen, let's turn to international affairs now. Mr. Della Pia, this is for you to start. What role should the U.S. be playing in the war in Ukraine?
We are, at this point, holding together a very strong NATO alliance that has a lot to lose if the Ukraine goes down. I think it's important to be someone who is someone who studies history. Those who fail to remember the past are condemned to repeat it. That Santa Anna said that. What we need to do is remember what happened when they just allowed Hitler to just take a little. This isn't going to stop with this. This Putin that my opponent's party refuses to condemn, he is part and parcel of a lot of the things that are going wrong with inflation and with the cost of fuel. So we absolutely need to support the Ukraine as we can.
Mr. Langworthy, the same question. You have 60 seconds.
I mean, that is just utter nonsense what he just said. Here's your condemnation. Putin is a murderer and he's a madman. And we cannot allow the Ukraine to be taken over. And we need to continue to support our NATO alliance and to support Ukraine in these efforts. But the idea that my opponent would suggest that we support Vladimir Putin's efforts is absolutely nonsense.
And so, Mr. Langworthy, what role should the U.S. be playing in that war?
I'm not prepared to say that the U.S. should ever, consider ground troops. But we have supported funding. We should continue to do so, and we should monitor the situation greatly. But our NATO alliance is strong. It needs to get even stronger.
Mr. Della Pia, 15 seconds.
I think the authorization for the use of force is something that's kind of gone into history. Congress is no longer involved in that decision-making process as much as it should be. They need to go on the record having debated the issue and decide whether it's appropriate to send forces or not.
We'll turn to agriculture now. The 23rd District is very rural. There is a farm bill coming up next year. I want to ask each of you what your priorities will be to advocate for in the 2023 farm bill. Mr. Langworthy, we'll start with you.
Well, I grew up in Chautauqua and Cattaraugus counties, and a lot of my friends, used to work on a dairy farm that their father and their mother owned before they'd even come to school every morning. And those family farms, unfortunately, in many cases, are a thing of the past, as they've had to sell to larger farmers. Either their farms got big or they went out of business. We need to support and put price supports in place for our northeastern dairy and safeguard, their needs greatly. But I have enjoyed touring all of the agricultural interests across this district. I mean, the southern tier is rich in agriculture. It'll be an absolute top priority of mine in serving in Congress and working with our farmers and our agribusiness people to strengthen this part of our critical economy.
As it pertains to the farm bill, Mr. Langworthy, what type of support for northeastern dairy are you referring to?
Well, we look at the dairy compacts and the pricing supplies that will be in the farm bill. There's a whole lot of wrangling that will go on in Washington in the next year for this once every 5-year farm bill. We need to make sure that Western New York's interests are at the table, and I think this is a great opportunity to have bipartisan cooperation with the New York delegation to make sure that New York's agricultural interests are represented in this important bill.
Mr. Della Pia, the farm bill, what's important to you?
The Farm Bill in the 30s, when it started, 70% of the money went to small farms. And now, 30% to large agribusiness. And now it's the opposite. And I'm concerned about family farms going under. They're on a razor-thin margin. They need to have price supports. They need to have someone who's going to provide for them immigration reform that will allow us to bring in year-round workers from South and Central America who are fully vetted, who will pay taxes, pay Social Security, and they can stay 1 year, 2 year, 3 year, 5 years, and actually provide an economic benefit for our country and support our agricultural dairy farmers.
New question, gentlemen. Mr. Langworthy, on your website, you write that you ushered in a new fighting spirit that led to the charge to force Cuomo, former Governor Andrew Cuomo, from office. So the question is, why are you trying to connect Cuomo's resignation to your time as state party chairman when it was widely reported that he stepped down after a prosecutor from his own party investigated him and he received plenty of pressure from Democratic leaders?
I have a pretty crystal clear record where this pertains to. We had a lot of people in both parties that toed the line for Andrew Cuomo. He had co-opted many even in the Republican Party. I ran for state party chairman on a platform to rebuild, retool, and revitalize the Republican Party and take the fight to Andrew Cuomo to make this governor's race that we're in the middle of right now a competitive one, which we have accomplished very much. Andrew Cuomo was a tyrant. He was a bully. He was a thug. And we took him on every single step of the way. The corruption that was revealed in the last 3 years in his administration, I'm very proud of, because I went to every corner of New York State to talk about how his administration was taking this state in the wrong direction, that he was trampling on our personal freedoms, on our rights, on our futures. And New York has exported far too many of our young people, and Andrew Cuomo, frankly, was the greatest realtor that the state of Florida has ever had. And I'm very proud of the work that we've done ending this tenure, because I didn't call for his resignation. I called for his impeachment.
Mr. Della Pia, on your website, you write that someone who is not a dangerous criminal or a flight risk should not have to sit in jail to await trial. We must create a policy that condemns actions, not income. Tell me what you mean by that.
The social good that we're talking about, and this is a state issue, but I think it's important that we comment when we're asked. Certainly, if someone does not have a violent past, does not have a record, is not a flight risk, and is someone who is not presenting a risk to the community, we shouldn't force him or her to stay in jail so that they lose their job before they're even convicted. Now, my opponent's going to want to say, well, what about this murder that just happened? Well, if you look at it, I saw that he definitely had a record of doing just this. Domestic abuse was part of him. He was a flight risk. He was clearly someone that needed to have a bail, a cash bail, and someone missed the boat. They made a mistake because there is a provision that involves a pattern of domestic abuse, and it needs to be considered.
Mr. Langworthy, we'll give you 30 seconds to respond.
The elimination of cash bail, the discovery reform, everything that's happened to our criminal justice system has absolutely made every New Yorker less safe. The example that Max was just discussing, losing the life of a beautiful woman named Kiara, who was shot in the face by her husband, who had been arrested on domestic violence charges just 2 days before, in front of her children in the car. A judge should have had the opportunity to say dangerousness was there. But in the name of social justice, in this elimination of cash bail that people like my opponent are celebrating, they live in this fairy tale world that people are stuck in jail because they stole a loaf of bread.
Mr. Langworthy, thank you. Mr. Della Pia, 15 seconds to answer, if you would. You said a few moments ago someone dropped the ball. Who dropped the ball?
The judge. Because the way the law, as it is written, it allows the judge to look into a pattern of domestic abuse, and my understanding from the write-ups, and it could be limited, but he has a responsibility to consider that in making a bail decision.
Mr. Langworthy, 15 seconds before we move on.
It is absolutely not true. I've talked to a handful of judges that have all said the judges' hands were absolutely tied. Had they not ushered in that criminal justice reform in 2019, Kiara would be here today.
Okay, just a couple minutes left, gentlemen. Let's talk about marijuana. Earlier this year, the House passed a bill decriminalizing marijuana. Senate Majority Leader Schumer has signaled support for this. Do you support legalizing or decriminalizing marijuana federally? Mr. Della Pia, do you?
I absolutely do, and here's why. These people who have just been in prison for having some marijuana on them should not have a felony conviction that they can't get a job, that they can't be restored to their community. And if it's legal, if it's legal for people to sell it commercially, I think it's time to look at their records and, if appropriate, remove that part of their record so that they can re-enter their communities and become productive members of our society.
Mr. Langworthy, 60 seconds on what the federal government should do about marijuana.
Right now, we're struggling with a lot of states having a lot of different policies, and in some states having very unclear policies like New York does, where we don't quite know when things come online, who gets the right to open dispensaries, and we have a very complicated situation here. The complication of interstate commerce also is on the table, and banking. So I do think that we need to have a bipartisan solution towards how to manage the cannabis marketplace going forward. The decriminalization seems to be well on its way, as Joe Biden has now, offered pardons to so many people that had convictions at this point.
Would you support that at a federal level and a state level? Because right now, that question lies with the states.
Well, I think that we need law enforcement at the table. That is something that I'm very concerned about. So many of our policies in New York are done without discussion with public safety. In the criminal justice discussion that we had in the last question is a great case of this. I mean, we should be talking to our police officers. We should be talking to our district attorneys, and not just, people that happen to get caught and arrested and convicted of crimes. We need to talk about the greater public good at the same time.
Gentlemen, thank you so much for your questions. That concludes the question and answer portion of tonight's debate. We'll now move on to closing statements, and we'll begin tonight with Mr. Langworthy.
Well, I want to thank WIVB, WNLO, our moderators here tonight, but also the viewers in the Elmira television market at WETM, and thank them for participating, here tonight. I thank my opponent, Max Della Pia, for entering the arena and running and debating me here tonight. I am running to bring a stable, conservative voice to the people of Western New York to represent them in Congress, in the most Republican district in the state of New York, in the northeastern United States. We have had a revolving door of members of Congress that have left for one reason or another, sometimes in shameful fashion. I want to end that and bring this district back to the esteemed place that it was, but also to take on the disastrous record of Joe Biden that has led to record inflation, out of control spending, and a real pinch on family budgets here in the southern tier and in Western New York. So by all means, if you think that Joe Biden's done a great job, then by all means vote for my opponent. But if you want change, if you want to bring balance back to Washington, D.C., and you want to get this country back on track, I humbly ask for your vote on November 8th.
Thank you, Mr. Langworthy. Mr. Della Pia, your closing statement.
I spent 32 years serving this country as an Air Force officer. I retired as a full colonel, and I had hundreds of people who I led. My philosophy for leadership has never been, like, you're going to do this because I'm the colonel. It is always team building. Not always. I did it twice. I had those. But anyway, it is team building, mutual respect, and inspiring people to join something greater than themselves and do something good for their country. And I think there are too many people who are driven by money, power, and ego in Congress. And we need to send a different type of congressperson, someone who's a public servant, someone who actually wants to basically work with others.
Mr. Della Pia, I'm sorry I got to cut you off. We only have 10 seconds left. Thank you to both the candidates. Before we leave, we want to remind you to go out there and vote. Early voting starts on Saturday. Have a great night.